Hello everybody. Today I'm going to tell the story of a boxer called Len Wickwar from Leicester. Now Len Wickwar holds the world record for the most number of contests in a professional career. He boxed between 1928 and 1947. He was from Leicester and he had 473 professional contests. Now today we have journeymen that have well over 100, close to 200, even in some cases up to 300 contests, and they don't win many of them because they're journeymen. They form the away end, away corner at a boxing tournament. They're usually fighting a guy who's coming in with a winning record, and their job is to test him. And some really good skilled practitioners out there these days, they really know what they're doing, but they tend to win 6 out of 100. Len Wickwar, in his 473 contests, won 342 of them. He only actually lost 86 times in his career. That's some record. This is a really good fighter. As I say, he boxed between 1928 and 1947. The next highest I've been able to find, this isn't just in the UK, this is worldwide, is also a UK fighter, a chap boxing at the same time as Len, out of the same stable, and his name was George Marsden. He was from Nottingham and he had 375 professional contests. And again, he won most of them. He was a really good fighter. He was just short of the British title level. Now, Wickwar had 98 more fights than the chap who's second on the lists. 98 professional contests. That's a career in itself. That's nearly 100 bouts. That for anybody is a long career, but this is just the gap between him and the next chap down. As I say, now I've researched British boxing for a long time, and I've only ever managed to find 11 boxers from the UK who had 300 or more contests. 2 of them did it in the last 25 years, and like I say, they were journeymen, Peter Buckley and Christian Late. They both had exactly 300 fights each. All the rest, the other 9, were all pre-war, and of those 9, 3 of them were managed by the same man, and that's Len Wickwar, George Marsden, and another chap from Leicester by the name of Bert Ison. He boxed under the name Tiger Bert Ison, and he had well over 300 contests himself. So what is it about this manager, George Biddles? He had a reputation for putting it mildly, finding his boxers work, and he certainly did that. There won't be many around today who remember George Biddles, but he was a real grand old character of British boxing. 50 years ago, 60 years ago, if you went around the dressing rooms of the small halls up and down the country, you'd run into George all over the place. He was a very prolific promoter, trainer and manager, and he boxed himself for a short while. We'll talk about that in a moment. George was another lad from Leicester, born round about 1904. His uncle boxed, a chap by the name of Billy Biddles. He boxed from 1908 to 1914. He served in the Leicester Regiment, and he boxed amongst in a number of army camps around about 1908. Cliff. Let's get his record out and have a look. He boxed as Private Biddles. He had 18 contests that I've found. Possibly he will have had more, but I've tracked 18 down. He won 9 and lost 9. Started out in 1908 at Cliff Camp, like I say, and he boxed at the Corn Exchange in Ashford, Aldershot, places you'd expect squaddies to be boxing at. But round about, well, he boxed, even as a serving soldier, he boxed at the Corn Exchange in Leicester in 1908, Folkestone. And then he had 3 contests in 1912 and 1914, all of which were at the Boulevard Rink at Leicester. Now, the promoter at that rink was a chap by the name of Professor Tom Wickwar, and I think this is Len's father. So George Biddles managed Len Wickwar in the 20s and 30s, but George's uncle, Billy, boxed on shows that were promoted by Len's father a good 20 odd years before that. So Private Biddles, George's uncle, his father was called Ernest, and he helped out a lot with the boxing side, helping his brother Billy, and then later on helping helping George when George was putting on shows in Leicester in the 20s. Now, George Biddles had his life story published in Boxing News, but in the summer of 1978, actually. They had a 2-page feature every week, and it ran right the way through till January the following year, so that's 6 months. And he was such a well-respected figure in the game with such a good story that Boxing News decided that they'd run his as kind of an autobiography. I think George pretty much wrote in the first person himself, and it was very, very interesting. He talked in there early on about how he himself boxed. He mentions fighters that I simply can't find any trace of. And what you often find with people who claim, like Jack Solomons did this as well. He claimed to have contests that you really can't find. A few others have done it. Mickey Duff, on the other hand, had a really good career. He had 60-odd fights and didn't lose many of them. So some of the promoters did box. Biddles, I have found 3 for him, all 1923 and 1924, all in Leicester. He won 1 and lost 2. He himself admitted he was no real fighter, but he'd got in there, got the gloves on, loved the game. In 1924, no, wait a minute, when was it? I think it was, might have been 1926 actually. He got a job in Ireland, and he'd been married, he had a child, he was only about 20 years old, and he went over to Ireland, working in a factory, and it didn't go very well. And when he came back to the UK a couple of years later, he was faced with, am I going to work? Am I going to get a job like most of the people I know in Leicester, in a factory or something? Or am I going to head out on my own and try and make some money out of boxing, which was obviously his love? And he decided to do the latter. So he set himself up as a boxing manager in 1928. And here is a picture of him round about that time with 2 lads out of his stable. This would be taken in 1928, which is the year he managed to get his very first fighter, a chap called Colin MacDonald from Leicester, good fighter, a gig at Liverpool Stadium. And from then on, he developed quite a successful stadium of lads from Leicester and took them all around the country, and as I say, became a very prolific boxers manager. Now, George was very, very good at keeping records. He kept he took all the cuttings out of the newspapers for the lads, he was manager of, and he put them all in scrapbooks. He had a big collection of scrapbooks. He also had some diaries within which he recorded which boxers were boxing where and what the purse was. And thankfully, I've acquired examples of each of these. This is George's original diary from 1933 through 1934. And it's adorned with newspaper cuttings, very, very many of which, as you can imagine, relate to Len Wickwar and his long career of 473 contests. And round about 33 and 34, he was extremely active indeed. And we'll have a little look at 1 or 2 of these pictures as we go along. But first of all, let's just look at George's stable of fighters. Now, I'm leaping ahead now 10 years. This is just to make the point about what sort of manager Biddles was. You can see here a manager's card which was printed in Boxing News. It's dated November the 16th, 1938. And as you can see, it's entitled Biddles' Boys. And this is how managers used to project themselves and their stables in those days. Here are my lads, in other words. I operate out of the Star and Garter, which at that time he'd moved to Derby, or at least he had a base in Derby. And he was running out of it looks like a pub actually, on hotel. It might be a pub, it might be a hotel, we're not sure. Probably a pub. Hotel Street, St Mary's Gate, Derby. And here is his list of fighters. And right at the top, as you can see, boxing at 9 stone 9 pounds is Len Wickwar of Leicester. And second on the list is George Marsden of Nottingham. At this time, these were his 2 big drawing cards. And as I've said, these 2 boxers out of over 100,000 professional boxers that this country's produced, these 2 at the top of the list in terms of the most contests. Wickwar, as I say, 473, Marsden 375. Now, just going down, looking at these other lads here, Tommy Jones of Derby, he ended up having 150 contests. Eric Jones of Colville, had 170. Below him, Harry Brown of Derby, 107. Jack Strongbow, 123. Jack McKnight came over from Ireland, where he'd been boxing. He came over to the Midlands in the mid-30s and ended up boxing for Biddles, probably because he knew he could get a lot of work and therefore quite a lot of money. He ended up having 234 professional bouts. And below that, as I mentioned earlier, Tiger Bert Ison, he ended up having 347. And there were another 3 lads on this list: Harry Ainsworth of York, Tommy Kelly of Derby and Ginger Brandt of Leicester, who all topped 100 bouts. Brandt had 172. These guys were winning more than they were losing. So of that list there of, I don't know, 25, probably something like that, fighters, 11 of them had 100 or more bouts. And Biddles was a man you could rely on. If you wanted to fight, he'd get you a fight. Now at the time, Biddles would have been taking probably 25% of the boxer's purse, which was the maximum amount he would be allowed to take. So if he's got a fighter boxing for, say, £10, top of the bill somewhere, Biddles would take £2.10 shillings, or today's money £2.50 out of that. And the more fighter earned, the more he boxed, the more money Biddles made. So he's got 11 lads here who have had between them 8, 4, 1,000, 12, 80, 1,400, 16, 30, 19, 1980, 2000, about 2,200 fights those 11 lads had, and he'd be taking 25% of their purse. Quite a lot of money. He was quite a successful promoter as well in Leicester, as we'll see, and that's another opportunity for him again to make money. Very often he'd run a show and he'd have his own lads on the bill, so he was keeping a percentage of the profit that the show made, or indeed all the profit once he'd paid the fighters, but the fighters were also paying him out of their purse for putting the show on. So he did all right, did George, I think, out of the game in the long run, and it was a game that he was actively involved with from 1928 until 1976. Now, going back, Biddles, when he came out of the game, Biddles, he packed in 1976, and his last really big contest that he was involved with, one of his boxers, he picked up Richard Dunn, the Yorkshireman who'd been British heavyweight champion, ended up getting bombed out by Joe Bugner. But Dunn boxed Muhammad Ali for the world heavyweight title in Munich in 1976. He only lasted 5 rounds, I think, from memory. He managed to catch Ali with 1 or 2 shots, but I mean the difference in class between those two is about as far as it gets in world heavyweight boxing. No disrespect to Dunn, tough guy, Yorkshireman. But he went to Biddles towards the back end of his career. And once he'd taken Dunn to Munich to box for the world heavyweight title, that's about as big as it gets as a boxing manager, and that's pretty much when an aged Biddles packed in. Just a few years before that, he was the manager of Jack Biddle, again British heavyweight champion, boxed right the way through the 60s. He is derided these days because of his last 3 fights, in which in each case he was flattened really quickly. But he was a decent light heavy and a pretty decent heavyweight, Biddle. He managed to outpoint Bugner after Bugner had beaten Cooper in 71 in that controversial contest. He lost his title to the Irishman Danny McAlinden in a chaotic fight in Dublin in 1972. And Biddles was he was managing at that time Jack Biddle. And here you can see a photograph of the contest. This is a still actually from the fight film. It's not very clear, but down in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see in white, you can see our man George Biddles. So he's involved in 2 big heavyweight fights there involving 2 British champions. Prior to that, he managed Wally Swift in the 60s, Nottingham, a good fighter from Nottingham. He took Hogan Kid Bassi to the world title in the 1950s. Hogan Kid Bassi came over from Nigeria in the 50s to this country. Biddles managed him right the way to the world title. And that was his most successful fighter, I think. It was his only world champion. In the late 40s and early 50s, he picked up 3 lads from nearby to Leicester. 1 was from Leicester and 2 others were from a little village called Spratton, which is quite near Leicester. Jeff Tite and Roy Davies were from Spratton, and Rick Sanders from Leicester. And at the back end of the 40s, the late 40s, just into the early 50s, these 3 guys often appeared on the same bill. They were stablemates, as you can see, the 3 of them in this picture. all managed by Biddles. And just look at their records. This again sums up Biddles. Tite had 82 bouts in 5 years. That's 16 a year. Davies had 106 in 7 years. And Rick Sanders had 109 bouts in 5 years. So 2 of them topped the 100 and 1 of them came close, and they were generally only in the game just for a few years. But they were boxing everywhere, making fairly decent money, of which Biddles, like I say, was taking his cut. And these lads are very, very typical of Biddles fighters. He got them work. If you want to box, I'll get you a fight. Now, interestingly, when he told his story to Boxing News in the 1970s, as I say, he states there is in second or third week of this running, an interesting paragraph which he states, under the circumstances that they often took engagements that they shouldn't have taken, maybe too soon after the last contest, and that could just be a few days. Maybe we were giving too much weight away. In other words, he put lads in, maybe he's weighed 9'9" naturally, but he put him in with a guy at 10 stone, maybe he's in a match made at 9'12". So the other opponent would boil down slightly, but in the ring he'd probably be above 10 stone. But one of his lads really couldn't get above 9'9", but he'd take the fight anyway because it was money. He says maybe the opposition was far too experienced. In other words, he'd put them in with a chap who's probably too good. But it's, you know, you'll lose on points maybe, you might learn a bit, you might get stopped. But what the hell, you're going to get a tenner and I'm going to get £2.10 of it. So in you get. He says, but take them we did because we needed the dough. We needed the dough. That's him and the fighter. And most of the time in the 20s and 30s that Biddles' stable was operating, with hard times, you know, it was depression. And after the war, of course, this country was hugely indebted to America. You could get work all right, but the times weren't great. And people generally were quite hard up. So a lot of fighters were boxing. They didn't want to fight necessarily. Or they wanted to retire, but they couldn't afford it because the money was decent. He says, I make no apology for these boys boxing so often. The times and the economic conditions, mass unemployment, and the need for money made it necessary. He's justifying his approach because times were hard. Now, the boxers very often would be very happy to box 20 or 30 times in a year because they could be earning far more than they would if they were working in a factory. He says, they had a grand life. We used to travel hundreds of miles in my old car every week with the boys singing away as we bowled along. He makes it sound so romantic. But he did have a car. A lot of fighters in those days would be put on a train if they were going for fights. So let's say they're from Leicester or Nottingham or Birmingham or somewhere, and they took a fight at Liverpool or Leeds, Newcastle, London. Most of them would go down on the train, very often on their own. Biddles, however, had his own car, and he would take the lads. He very often had 2 or 3 lads on the same bill. So if Wickwar was, for instance, booked on a show at, I don't know, Morecambe or somewhere like that, Biddles would probably blag his way with the promoter to take another couple of lads along as well. He said, oh, you know, you're short of lads for the 6 and 8, so I can bring 2 more from Leicester if you want. And the promoter would be very happy with that. Of course, Biddles would have a full car and he'd be taking 3 lots of 25% rather than 1. So very, very interesting life story. Here is a picture of him actually with, this was later on in the series, in September 1978, this picture comes from. There you can see George looking at one of his books with all the list of his boxers and their contests in, and a big pile of ring magazines and boxing news is below that. And as I say, a meticulous record keeper. And the books have survived, and as I say, I have some of them. So let's just, again, let's look at this life story and pick up 1 or 2 quotes. He says, when he came into boxing, Biddles says this, there was little or no boxing taking place in Leicester in 1926, although there were plenty of young fellows eager to take up the sport. I was only 21 years of age myself, and with a couple of my pals began training in the club room lent to us for free by the landlord of the Friar Tuck Tavern, a pub in Leicester. I've got a picture of it. I believe it's long gone. one of those, well, so many pubs are disappearing these days, and this is one. This picture looks as if it's taken possibly in the 80s or even 90s. So that pub was probably around for a good while. It was a rough pub, evidently. But this is where Biddles started off with his lads, with his first gym in this pub. He says, "We could not return to the gymnasium of my former trainer and manager because one of my pals had come to blows with him." Typical boxers. And he'd been thrown out of the gym. I decided to stick by my pal, and we opened up a club room at the Friar Tuck as a gym. And this was the situation that literally threw me into a lifetime spent in professional boxing. We began to be joined by other boys in our training sessions, all looking for contests, but without success. The patrons of the public house used to crowd into the club room to watch our training, and a collection used to be taken to help buy equipment. Now, this is very typical of the 20s. You had a pub in a working class area, you had lads wanting to fight, you had a spare room, you could open up, allow something like Biddles and his fighters to come in and train. All your regulars would be more than happy to go and watch the lads sparring and training. And of course, a little collection taken for them to get equipment, fantastic. They put a few coppers into a hat or whatever. But the landlord was quidsing because these guys were in his pub watching the fighters. And of course, what were they doing? They were all necking pints. So very good idea. So many pubs in those days used to allow boxers in. You can't imagine it today, boxers training in a pub in the evening and people drinking and just wandering around the gym watching them. I mean, it just would never happen. He goes on to say, "My enthusiasm knew no bounds. I used to cycle straight from the factory where I worked." So when he starts off, he's obviously got a job just in case the boxing doesn't go well. And he says, every night he used to do this, except weekends. Now, at this point, he's got a 2-year-old child and a wife. But never mind. He's going to work all day in the factory and go down the gym most nights, and of course at weekends. When I used to write to every boxing promoter whose address I could find, extolling the talents of my pals and asking for work. Biddles was always a good publicist. I just turned 22 when I secured my first engagement. I can imagine the wonderful feeling it must be to receive notification that one has won a fortune on the pools. But even today, I can still recall the wonderful thrill of receiving the first reply to my batch of letters. And this is when he got Colin MacDonald a job at Liverpool Stadium. He then says, "Of all the boxers who have been in my care over the last 40 years, there is one boy who, in my thoughts and my recollections, overshadows all the rest. He never became a champion, not even a minor title." Well, that's not true, actually. He did win certainly minor titles, but he was never an area champion or a British champion. He says, in a career that lasted 19 years, he took part in no less than 467 contests. Now, this is Biddles talking about Wickwar. 467, he kept meticulous records, but he missed some because I've found another 6 for Wickwar that obviously Biddles has missed. He says, he was a Leicester boy and his name was Len Wickwar. I recall well our first meeting. It was in 1928. And I was now nicely organised with my team of boxers and my regular weekly show at the Spinney Hill Club. Now, the Spinney Hill Club, I think, is still there. Working Men's Club in Leicester, in the Spinney Hill area. And Biddles used to run shows there every week. And that will be the nursery for his stable of young lads. So he managed the lads, put them on, take a cut of their purse, and then promote the show. And generally speaking, it was well attended. And he must have done quite well for himself. He says, at the Friar Tuck Gymnasium, amongst a crowd of boys in training, I had a very useful flyweight called Billy Newbold getting into condition for a contest at Nottingham. I was late in arriving at the gym, and as I opened the door, a most surprising sight met my gaze. Bill Newbold was quite a clever and experienced boxer, was sparring with a young lad who was in his shirt sleeves and long trousers and who, to my utter surprise, was completely outboxing the experienced professional Bill Newbold. I waited until the sparring ended and then called the young unknown across to me. As I removed his boxing gloves, I said to him, "Hello, my lad, what's your name?" And the boy replied, "Leonard Arthur Wickwar." "Where did you learn to box like that?" I said, and he replied, "Nowhere. I often box with Bill. He lives next door to me." It was true. These boys lived in a little back street in the centre of the city of Leicester, And after I'd convinced Len Wickwar that he had the ability to become a successful pro, I had quite a rush of young budding fighting men, and they all lived in that one little back street. So this is a real tough working class area of Leicester where one street produces fighters, and because one of them, Billy Newbold, who was a good fighter, Billy was, because his next door neighbour saw he was a fighter, he decided to spar with him, and then he ended up going pro with Biddles, and as we say, goes on to have 473 professional contests. Now if we just look at the record for Len Wickwar, this is the Biddles fighter, as I say. So let's look at December 1936. December the 14th, Wickwar goes to Swansea to box a lad called Willie Piper, draw 10 rounds. 2 days later, December the 16th, he's at Hull, boxing a lad from Sheffield, win on points, 10 rounds. 2 days after that, he's at Blackpool at the Tower Circus, boxing a good fighter from Salford called Frank Barton, loses on points. Now this is over 9 rounds. Now you don't see many 9-round contests. The reason was at the time the Board of Control issued an edict saying no boxer can take part in contests of 10 rounds or more within the same week. So what the promoters did was say, right, okay, you boxed 2 days ago in a 10-rounder, so you're boxing a 9, and they got around the rule that way. It would have been a 10-rounder, but because the rule said you can't box 10, they just said, well, box 9 then. Now, in any event, he'd boxed 2 days before the one in the middle. So he managed to get round the rule on December the 16th when he'd boxed 2 days before that, but on the 18th, he couldn't get round it. That might be because the board simply didn't know about the contest, or they just pulled a flanker. But that's why there's a 9-rounder there. So now let's look at 1933, October 1933. Len Wickwar goes to Mile End Arena in London, in the East End of London. That was an open-air arena. He's boxing in a 12-rounder against a lad from Newcastle, wins on points. He travels back that day, and on the 9th of October, the day after, he's in Chesterfield in another 12-rounder, where he stops a lad from North Shields called Alf Palozzi, stops him in the 7th. So that's 2 bouts in 2 days. What happens? The next day, October the 10th, he goes to Smethwick in Birmingham and boxes a lad called Herbie Nurse and loses on points in 10 rounds. So this man has boxed a 12-rounder, a 12-rounder and a 10-rounder in 3 consecutive days. Beyond belief. Let's look at 1934, for instance. So this is just dipping in and out of his record. February the 11th. 1934, he boxes up in Barnsley against a local lad called Chuck Parker. Chuck boxed for the British welterweight title a couple of years after, and he was Northern Area welterweight champion for 2 years between 1935 and 6. So he's a good fighter on the way up. He beats Wickwar on points over 12 rounds on February the 11th. 2 days later, Wickwar's boxing for Biddles at the Spinney Hill Club in Leicester, wins on points against another Leicester fighter in 10 rounds. 2 days later, down in Brighton, boxing a 12-rounder, wins on points. The next day, he goes to Blackpool in a belt competition. This is only a 4-rounder because it's a competition with very good lads though, and he knocks his opponent out, a Belfast fighter called Jack Flynn, knocks him out in the first round. He then has 3 days off and then goes to Coventry to box Lyndon Bennett of Brierley Hill, wins on points in 10. So between February the 11th and February the 19th, which is 9 days, he's boxed 5 times. 2 12-rounders, 2 10-rounders and a 4-rounder. And then, actually, before that February the 11th fight, he'd also boxed on February the 5th and February the 8th. That's at Crystal Palace in London and up in Glasgow. And just to finish it off, on February the 25th, he boxes in Belfast in an 8-rounder. So he's boxed in England, Scotland and Ireland. He's had 8 contests, 2 of which are over 12 rounds, 3 of which are over 10 rounds, 1 is over 8, 2 are over 8 rounds, and plus the 4-rounder. So he's had 8 contests in just February 1934. That year he boxed 59 times, 59 fights in 52 weeks. And just looking at the next page, he boxed 15-rounder in March, 2 15-rounders in March, another 15-rounder in May, 12s and 10s in between. I mean, most of his contests are 10, 12 or 15 rounds. Now, a lot of these would be 2-minute rounds in those days. Not all of them. Quite a few would be 3 minutes, but a lot would be 2-minute rounds. He boxed 59 times in 1934. In 1935, he boxes 52 times. That's 1 a week. And in 1936, he boxes 48 times. So that's 159 fights in 3 years, most of which were, as I say, he'd be top of the bill or very close to it, 10, 12 or 15 rounders. So it's an incredible record. He came back after the war. He'd had his last fight in 1939. The war came along. He had a couple of bouts in 1940, and then he came back after the war and boxed 4 times between 1946 and 1947. Now, if we go back to when when Wickwar started, this is at the back end of 1929, and here's Biddles again with advertising his stable of fighters as they were in 1929. This is 8 years before that other one we looked at, and you can see Wickwar right down the bottom there, 7 stone 10 pounds. Below him, Tiger Ison, the other lad who had 300 fights, and they boxed each other 17 times, by the way, Wickwar and Ison, and Wickwar won 16 of them. From what I understand, the one that Ison won was somewhere in the Midlands, away from Leicester, and the promoter ended up, I think the promoter ended up having to referee that night. We got somebody who wasn't a trained referee anyway, and they gave Ison the verdict. It's the only time he ever beat Wickwar. But they were used to fighting each other. So on that stable, as you can see, Sicky Colton's at the top, 1929. That's when we looked at that picture earlier of Biddles with his 2 lads in 1928. The one here on the right is Sicky Colton. Now at this point, Wickwar, although he's only been boxing a little over a year, and he's right down the end of the stable, towards the bottom, by this stage he's already had 29 fights, of which he's won 24. Now, here is a cutting from 1930 showing a very, very young Wickwar with a belt. And it says here, the new county champion. Len Wickwar defeats Billy Carter. The Leicestershire bantamweight title changed hands last night at the Belgrave Working Men's Club. Len Wickwar gained a points victory at the expense of the holder Billy Carter over 10 rounds. So Wickwar here winning a very unofficial title. It wasn't uncommon in those days for promoters to put county championships on. They would just pick 2 lads and say, right, this is for the bantamweight title of Leicestershire, I should say. And there might be 2 pretty good lads, and maybe other lads with an equal claim, but the promoter was innovative and came up with the idea of this title and just put it on. So there's Wickwar winning a title of sorts. Here's a picture from 1933 with Biddles on the left and Wickwar on the right. And it states here, the new Midlands featherweight champion. With the Ted Salmon's Gold Championship belt. Now, the Midlands area didn't exist in 1933. That came later. In fact, the Midlands area didn't exist until after the war. In 1933, there were only 2 areas in England, the north and south. So this again would be an unofficial title that somebody's put a fight on, and Wickwar's won it, and he's become, in quotes, the Midlands champion. So although we said earlier that he never won a title, I said he had won a few kind of minor ones. The Championship of Leicestershire and the unofficial Midlands title. They were titles that he certainly did win. Here is a bill from the Spinney Hill Club, which is on Frisbee Road, Humberston Road in Leicester. June the 13th, 1933, and there's Wickwar at the top of the bill against another Leicester fighter called Pat Butler. Butler went on to become British welterweight champion. Boxed some good fighters. Wickwar Butler there. August 1933, Biddles Busy Boys, and a list of fighters, and again you can see Marsden, Butler, Wickwar, Ison, all on there. Here is a bill for Wickwar and Ison, again at the Spinney Hill Club in 1933. 1934, he's boxing at the Royal Albert Hall against Paddy Peters in a 6-rounder, as you can see. Here's one in 1935 at the Winter Gardens in Morecambe. These are just plucked at random for my collection, but it just shows you the sorts of places he was boxing. Here he is boxing against a lad called Harry Woodward of Preston. And this is typical of the Winter Gardens adverts. You've got the boxing at the top, or at least contained within the week's entertainment. And you've got here, amongst other things going on, Duncan's Scotch Collies and the man with the electric voice and the world's Australia's most famous illusionist, the Great Levanter. I love these little adverts, and often you'll see boxing, the boxing advert containing people like Laurel and Hardy would appear at the Winter Gardens in Morecambe. It was a hell of a good venue that held about 3,000, great for boxing, and the hall is still there, although it's disused now and quite sadly becoming a bit run down. That hall is still there. Here's Wickwar weighing in for a contest at Barrow. This is 1936 against a good fighter from Barrow called Frank Hill, and that's Wickwar there on the scales. 1937, Wickwar makes the front cover of Boxing, which is, of course, today known as Boxing News. And here is Wickwar on the front cover of that. This here is this is from Biddles' diary, 1934, Leicester Boxing Club. So this is a gym on Erskine Street, and there is the list of fighters you can go along to see if you join the club and train with. And top of the list there, as well as Bert Eisen appearing, you've got top of the list, we've got the great Len Wickwar. And these are all little cuttings from the diary, as I say, all very interesting. Len Wickwar and Butler weighing in for that fight that we had the poster for earlier, or the handbill for. And it states here that the weigh-in is at the Haunch of Venison. And this is for the Lightweight Championship of Leicester. Now, at the time, the Haunch of Venison was a pub owned by a big manager from Leicester by the name of Joe Jacobs, who became Leicester's leading promoter in the 40s and 50s. Joe was the landlord of the Haunch of Venison, and this is where the weigh-ins used to frequently take place for shows in Leicester. And I believe the pub is still there. It's got another name now. It's Orange something, Orange Tree or something, I'm not sure, but the pub's still there anyway. Here's a cutting for the Granby Halls, and here's an image of the, first of all, here's an image of the inside of the Granby Halls, a big hall in Leicester. You can see the ring there and all the seats laid out. And this is for a contest that Larry Gaines had. But that's what it looked like in the Granby Halls. And this is when Wickwar boxed the great Jack Kidd Berg in 1930, I think it was 1934. And here is a picture of Wickwar sparring with Tiger Eisen at the Hollybush Hotel in Leicester, somewhere else that Wickwar no doubt had a gym. Here we see Berg in the corner with, that looks like, is that Harry Levine on the left? It might be. But there, anyway, that's Jack Kidd Berg getting ready to fight Wickwar at the Granby Halls. Wickwar was disqualified for holding that night, but here is Wickwar leaning on, if not holding, Berg, and that's Wickwar in the white shorts. And that might be, is that Jimmy Wilde, the ref? I don't think it is, but Wilde was a referee at this time, the great Welsh flyweight. That looks a bit like him, I don't think it is him. But anyway, Wilde, as I say, at that time was a referee. And this is the headline: Wickwar fights a reputation and loses. A 6-round disqualification. So Wickwar boxing Jack Kidd Berg, great fighter. Here's a picture of Wickwar putting Freddie Miller onto the canvas. Now, Freddie Miller at this time was a world featherweight champion, an American fighter, and a very, very good one. And that is Wickwar putting him to the floor. Now, he ended up losing that fight on points. And perhaps his biggest contest, Wickwar, was when he boxed Eric Boone, the great young fighter who went on to become British lightweight title holder. In fact, I think at the time of this contest, he was the British champion. This was not a British title fight, but this is taking place at the Leicester Tigers football ground. And Eric Boone, Wickwar. And the programme notes talking here about Wickwar and saying, you know, this is saying here he's won more than 400 contests. That's not true. It wasn't far off, but as usual, when the promoters put these programmes together, they make false claims and make fighters look better than they are for the purposes of publicity. But that's the programme for that contest. Boone knocked him out, unfortunately. It wasn't a great fight, and there is film of it. This is the only film, I think, of Wickwar boxing, and I've got a copy of that film. And he got hammered by Boone, unsurprisingly. This is a programme for, I think this is his last contest, February the 10th, 1947. I think it is. Let's just check that, against Ginger Billy Armstrong. No, it's... In fact, he'd boxed a week before his last fight at Newcastle, had Wickwar, got knocked out in 5 rounds at Newcastle. This is 4 days later when he's matched with Ginger Billy Armstrong. He didn't fight on that evening. Possibly the knockout convinced him to retire. So this is a programme for Wickwar right at the end of his career. And as you can see at the bottom there, the promoter saying his next tournament will be 2 weeks later, and of course it's none other than George Biddles. Now, in 1952, in a Where Are They Now? He'd only been retired 5 years, but Boxing News are running a piece on Wickwar, and it states here that he's now around 40, and he's employed as a foundry hand at Leicester, and spends his spare time giving hints on the manly art to local schoolboys. He's married with 2 children, a boy and a girl. And this is when he died in 1980. This is a piece from Ron Olver's column, the Old Timers column in Boxing News, where the great Vic Hardwick, a wonderful historian, sadly died many years ago, paying tribute to Wickwar, pointing out that when he died, on that very same day, George Marsden died. This is Wickwar's stablemate, who had the 375 contest, the second highest of any pro ever. So not only did these 2 lads box for Biddles at the same time as each other, appearing all over the country on the same bills, but they both died on exactly the same day, which is quite a remarkable coincidence. In 1985, there was a piece in Boxing News, Ron Olver's series, The Professionals, a 2-page spread that talks about Wickwar. And there's a picture of him with Eric Boone looking at some old film of their fight. That's Wickwar with his cauliflower ear on the right-hand side, and Boone looking considerably younger with a full head of hair on the left. Now, just to conclude, the sort of money that Wickwar would have made as a pro, because I've got parts of Biddles' collection. Biddles was very, very meticulous, as I say, and this is his diary for 1939. He got it from Boots. Described as a scribbling diary, but in here he records where his fighters were boxing and how much money they earned. So if we look in this diary for July 1939, this is for the Wickwar versus Jack Kidd Berg contest. Wickwar got paid £100 for that fight. Now at that time, the average weekly wage for a labourer or skilled labourer might be £3 to £4 a week. You might earn £200 a year, would be about right. That would be your annual salary as a working man. So Wickwar's got £100 for fighting Boone. And if we look elsewhere in the diary, let's just take 1939 as an example. When Wickwar boxed 15 times. 5 of those contests were in January 1939. He started out on the 1st of January, New Year's Day, at the Ring Blackfriars in London, and he earned £22, 10 shillings. That's £22.50 to boxing a 10-rounder against George Daly of Blackfriars, a good fighter, George. 16 days later, he's boxing at Earl's Court in an 8-rounder and earns £25. January the 27th, North Shields, a 10-rounder, he wins by knockout in 6. He gets £20 for that. 2 days after that, he's in the Ring Blackfriars again in in a 9-rounder, and he gets £22, 10 shillings. And then on the 31st of January, 2 days after that, he gets £30 for boxing at the Granby Halls in Leicester. So in January 1939, he's earned 47.10, 67.10, 89, 90. He's earned £120 in January 1939. And as I say, a normal year's salary for a labourer, a skilled labourer, then would be probably about 200. And throughout the rest of this year, he fights another 10 times for purses of £40, 15, £20, £30 plus 20% of the gate, £30 for fighting Glasgow, £100 for that Boone fight, £60 for a contest at Skegness, and then two more contests of £25. So he's earned a good, you know, 600 or 700 quid, I would say there. I can't add it up in my head. 400 or 500 anyway, just from boxing, which is way above what a skilled labourer would earn. And this is when he's only had 15 fights. Other years he was boxing 40 or 50 times. So one hell of a career. The world record for the number of contests. Len Wickwar, a phenomenon really, and a really interesting character. He lived, as I say, until 1980. And when he died, he would be just nearly 70 years old. And I have no idea what 473 professional contests would do to you. A lot of fighters end up punch drunk with far less contests than that. But from what I understand, Len Wickwar was in pretty good health towards the end of his life. And he will, of course, have suffered from boxing without any doubt. But I don't think he ended up as bad as many others who had far less contests did. He's an absolute legend of the sport, as was his manager, George Biddles. And that's their story. Thank you.